The neighborhood association meeting was scheduled for 7 p.m. on a Thursday, but Margaret Whitmore arrived at 6:47. She always arrived early. It was the kind of woman she was, strategic, prepared, the kind of woman who kept her garden pruned to magazine cover perfection and whose mailbox post had been repainted 3 times in the past 2 years to match the seasonal aesthetic of Oakwood Ridge. The community center's fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting everything in a sickly institutional glow. 12 folding chairs arranged in a semicircle. Margaret had arranged them herself last month. Proper spacing, proper angles. She settled into the front seat, arranging her leather portfolio across her lap, and waited for the others to file in. They came in clusters, the couples mostly. The Hendersons from Maple Street, who owned the neighborhood's only Tesla. The Chens from Birch Avenue, whose landscaping budget apparently rivaled small nations. Derek Paulson, the neighborhood watch coordinator who wore his role like a military uniform. And finally, at 6:59, the Romeros, late as always, whispering apologies that nobody asked for. Margaret tapped her pen against her portfolio. 6:59, not 7S. The meeting would begin at 7 or exactly. Standards mattered. Thank you all for coming, Margaret began, not bothering to wait for the stragglers. We have several items on the agenda tonight. The holiday decoration guidelines. I'd like to remind everyone that inflatable decorations are, and I quote from our bylaws, aesthetically incongruent with the community standard. Second, the status of the South End storm drain repairs. And third, she paused, letting her eyes drift across the group. And third, we need to address the property at 447 Maple Drive. Derek Paulson straightened. He'd been waiting for this. Margaret could see it in the tightening of his jaw. I've documented the situation, Margaret continued, opening her portfolio. She withdrew a series of photographs, each more damning than the last. The 1987 Buick LeSabre parked in the driveway of 447 Maple Drive, paint deterioration visible across the entire vehicle, rust accumulation on the undercarriage and hood, windows compromised, cloudy, possibly fungal growth inside. She passed the photos around. The group leaned in, studying them like they were crime scene evidence. This vehicle has been deteriorating in that driveway for... Margaret consulted her notes. For 8 months and 17 days. The property value impact alone is significant. My own appraisal shows a 3% depreciation in comparable homes on this street since the vehicle appeared. Who lives there? Linda Chen asked, though she probably already knew. Linda made it her business to know everything. Martin Gray, Margaret said. Purchased the property 6 years ago. Single occupant. No children. No... She hesitated slightly. No apparent reason to keep an inoperable vehicle. Have you talked to him? Derek asked. Twice. He refuses to discuss it. Says it's a personal matter. I attempted to cite Ordinance 4.3.2, which prohibits the storage of non-operational vehicles on residential property. He became defensive. Rude, actually. Said it was his property and his business. Margaret sat back, crossing her hands. She didn't often fail at anything, but Martin Gray had resisted her efforts with the stubborn, immovable will of a man who had nothing left to lose. The Henderson woman, Susan, wrinkled her nose. It's absolutely ruining the aesthetic. We're trying to maintain property values. Nobody wants to buy on a street with that sitting out in the open? Exactly, Margaret said, which is why I'm proposing we send a formal notice, citation for code violation. If he refuses to remediate, we pursue legal action through the HOA. I've already drafted the language. She slid a document across the table. 15 pages of carefully worded legal threat. She'd spent 4 hours on it, cross-referencing every applicable ordinance. It was airtight. Derek picked it up, flipping through. This is aggressive, Margaret. This is thorough, Margaret corrected. Standards matter. If we allow one property to decline, it sends a message that anything goes. That chaos is acceptable. I won't have that in Oakwood Ridge. By 7:32 p.m., the vote had passed unanimously. By 8:00 p.m., Margaret had the notice printed and ready to deliver. By 8:15 p.m., she was standing at the door of 447 Maple Drive, holding the document like it was a sword, and she was a knight serving justice. The house itself was modest, a 1970s ranch-style home with sensible landscaping and gray shutters. Neutral, forgettable. It could have been any house on the street except for the driveway. The Buick sat there like a corpse, slowly decomposing. Up close, the decay was worse than the photographs suggested. The hood had bloomed with rust flowers. That particular shade of deep orange-brown that came from years of moisture and oxidation. The passenger side door bore a long dent, the kind of damage that never gets fixed because fixing it would cost money, and clearly Martin Gray was the type of person who didn't spend money on things like automotive maintenance. The windshield bore a thin layer of road grime and pollen. Through it, Margaret could just make out the outline of the interior, a steering wheel, a dashboard, something dark and indeterminate in the back seat. She knocked. Hard, professional. The knock of a woman who had authority and was prepared to use it. It took 40 seconds, then a minute, then she knocked again. The door opened. Martin Gray stood in the doorway, and Margaret's first thought was, "This man is not well." It wasn't obvious at first glance. He wasn't emaciated or visibly ill, but there was something hollowed out about him, a quality of existing rather than living. He was perhaps in his late 50s, with gray hair that hadn't seen a razor or comb in several days, and the kind of tired in his eyes that no amount of sleep would fix. He was wearing a paint-stained button-down and jeans with a hole in the knee. Not from fashion. From life. "Yes?" he said. His voice was rough like old leather. "Martin Gray?" Margaret asked, though she already knew the answer. "Who's asking?" "Margaret Whitmore, president of the Oakwood Ridge Homeowner Association. We met 6 months ago. At the community picnic." She watched his face for recognition. "Nothing. Complete blank. I'm here on behalf of the neighborhood association," Margaret continued, her voice taking on the formal tone she reserved for official business. "We've received numerous complaints regarding the vehicle on your property. The 1987 Buick LeSabre. As you know, Ordinance 4.3.2 clearly prohibits the storage of non-operational vehicles on residential property. This is a formal notice of code violation." She extended the document. Martin didn't take it. It hung there between them, a sword waiting to be picked up. "The vehicle is operational," he said. "It clearly is not," Margaret countered. "It hasn't moved in 8 months. The paint is deteriorated. The windows are compromised. It starts every morning," Martin said quietly. "I go out there at 6 a.m. and I start it. I let it run for 5 minutes. It runs fine. It's just, I don't drive it anywhere." Margaret felt her frustration spike. This was exactly the kind of technicality and semantic nonsense that people like Martin Gray used to avoid responsibility. "Regardless of whether the engine is functional," she said coldly, "the vehicle is clearly unmaintained and presents an eyesore to the neighborhood. The ordinance—" "I heard you the first time," Martin said. "I'm not interested in discussing it. That car is not for sale, it's not going anywhere, and that's the end of it." He moved to close the door. Margaret did something she rarely did. She raised her hand to stop him. It was a gesture of pure instinct, a physical assertion of her will. "Mr. Gray," she said, her voice sharp as a blade, "I'm going to need you to take this seriously. The association has voted unanimously. You have 30 days to either remove the vehicle or file for a variance. If you don't, we will pursue legal remediation." "Legal remediation," Martin repeated, and there was something in his voice, a quality of despair so profound that it almost sounded like laughter. "You're going to sue me over a car." "We're going to enforce community standards," Margaret said. "There are rules. They exist for a reason. If everyone decided to let their property fall into disrepair whenever they felt like it, this neighborhood would be a slum." Martin looked at her for a long moment. There was no anger in his expression. That's what struck Margaret most. No defensiveness, no indignation. Just a man looking at someone speaking a language he no longer understood. "My daughter died," he said quietly. "In this car. 2 years ago, car accident. She was 16. Then he closed the door. Margaret stood on the porch, the document still extended, and felt something shift inside her chest. It wasn't guilt. She didn't allow guilt. It was more like the sensation of solid ground becoming unstable. Like a certainty she'd been standing on had developed a fissure. She lowered the document, turned back toward her car, and tried very hard not to think about what she'd just learned. That night, Margaret sat in her kitchen with a glass of wine she didn't really want. Searching the internet for Martin Gray and car accident and daughter, the news article was from the archives of the local paper, dated 2 years and 3 months ago. A short piece, the kind that runs after major accidents. Local teenager killed in traffic collision, 16-year-old Emma. Gray of Oakwood Ridge was pronounced dead at the scene of a multi-vehicle collision on Highway 405 at approximately 3:47 p.m. yesterday. According to the state police report, the vehicle driven by Gray, a 1987 Buick LeSabre registered to her father, Martin Gray, was struck by a commercial vehicle after drifting across 2 lanes. The cause of the drift was determined to be mechanical failure of the steering assembly, exacerbated by poor road maintenance. The commercial vehicle operator was cited for speed violation. No other injuries were reported. Funeral services pending. Margaret read it 3 times. Then she looked up Emma Gray Funeral and found a short obituary on the funeral home website. Emma Catherine Gray, born 16 years prior. Survived by her father. No mention of a mother. Emma had wanted to study marine biology. Emma had played clarinet in the school band. Emma was described by teachers as curious and kind-hearted. Margaret closed the laptop slowly. She poured the wine down the sink. She didn't sleep that night. Instead, she sat in her dark living room and thought about a girl she'd never met, who had been dead in a car for 2 years, and whose father she'd threatened with legal action for refusing to dispose of the only thing he had left of her. By morning, Margaret had made a decision. She would fix this. Not by rescinding the notice, that would look like weakness, like capitulation, but by being smarter, more strategic. She would find a way to solve the problem that didn't involve destroying Martin Gray in the process. She just had no idea what that way might be. Margaret didn't return to 447 Maple Drive that Friday. Instead, she spent the weekend doing something she hadn't done in years. She researched. Not the ordinances or the property values, but Martin Gray himself. She found his LinkedIn profile first. It hadn't been updated in 3 years. He'd been a structural engineer, according to the profile. Good job, stable career. Before that, he'd worked in construction management. The employment history was solid, consistent, the kind of background that spoke of a man who understood consequences and took responsibility seriously. She found his Facebook page, which was mostly inactive, except for the occasional share of an article about ocean conservation or environmental science. Emma's interests, Margaret assumed, though there were no posts directly about his daughter. The privacy settings were locked down, but not so much that Margaret couldn't see he had 347 friends and that his last post had been made 712 days ago. She found his name in the court records. Property taxes paid on time, every year. No criminal record, no lawsuits, no complications. He was, by every measurable standard, the kind of neighbor most people wanted, except for the car. On Monday morning, Margaret did something unprecedented. She skipped her regular 6 a.m. spin class. Instead, at 5:55 a.m., she sat in her car parked 3 houses down from 447 Maple Drive and waited. The sun rose slow and orange. The street remained quiet. At 6 a.m. exactly, Margaret saw Martin emerge from his house. He was wearing the same paint-stained shirt she'd seen him in before, now paired with a cardigan that had seen better decades. He was holding a travel mug of what was probably coffee. He walked to the Buick like a man approaching a sacred place. Margaret watched as he opened the driver's side door, and the rust flakes drifted away like autumn leaves. He reached in, turned the key, and the engine cranked to life. It was a terrible sound. The sound of pistons struggling against time, of seals that should have been replaced years ago, of metal grinding against itself in protest. But it started. Martin stepped back, letting it idle. He stood there, not getting in, not moving, just standing beside his dead daughter's car and listening to it breathe. The engine stuttered and coughed, the way very old things do when asked to remember how to live. The exhaust that came from the tailpipe was thick and black, toxic-looking. Margaret found herself holding her own breath. After 5 minutes, Martin reached in and turned off the engine. He stood there for another moment, and Margaret thought she saw his shoulders shake just slightly, just once. Then he turned and walked back to his house, leaving the car settling into silence. Margaret waited until his back door closed. Then she drove home, her hands shaking on the steering wheel. That afternoon, Margaret scheduled an appointment with a therapist. She'd never been to therapy before. She didn't believe in airing personal business to strangers. But she found herself Googling grief counseling and how to process trauma you didn't know you had. And before she could talk herself out of it, she'd called a number and booked a session for the following Thursday at 3 p.m. In the meantime, she did something else unprecedented. She ignored the Martin Gray situation. The notice stood, legally binding, but she didn't follow up. She didn't pressure Derek Paulson. She didn't mention it at the neighborhood watch meetings. She simply didn't. Linda Chen noticed, of course. Linda noticed everything. "You've been quiet about the Gray situation," Linda said on Wednesday, cornering Margaret at the community center after the beautification committee meeting. "Derek's ready to move forward with the legal action." "I thought that's what you wanted?" "I'm reconsidering the approach," Margaret said carefully. "Reconsidering? You were the one who was so fired up about it. Community standards and all that." Margaret looked at Linda, a woman in her mid-60s, well-maintained, sharp-eyed, with the kind of confidence that came from a life of never being wrong about anything that mattered. Margaret recognized herself in Linda. It wasn't a comfortable recognition. "I learned something about Martin's situation," Margaret said. "I think there might be extenuating circumstances." "Extenuating circumstances?" Linda's eyebrows rose. "It's a junk car. There are no circumstances that justify having a junk car in a residential neighborhood. That's the whole point of having community standards, so people don't get to have extenuating circumstances. So things don't fall apart. His daughter died," Margaret said quietly. "In that car? 2 years ago?" Linda's expression didn't change. "Oh," she said. "Well, that's sad. But he still needs to remove it." Margaret stared at her. "His 16-year-old daughter died in that car, and your response is that he needs to remove it?" "What else is he supposed to do?" Linda asked, genuinely puzzled. "Keep it rotting in his driveway forever? That's not healthy. That's not moving on. That's just dwelling." "Maybe dwelling is what he needs," Margaret said. "Maybe letting go of his daughter's car is asking too much." "Well, he should have thought about that before he bought a house in a community with standards," Linda said sharply. "The rest of us made the same choice. We all deal with our problems without impacting the neighborhood's aesthetic." Linda walked away, and Margaret felt something crystallize inside her, a clarity that was almost violent. She went home and pulled the notice off her refrigerator. Then she called Derek. "I'd like to withdraw the code violation against Martin Gray," she said without preamble. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. "The notice?" Derek finally asked. "The one we voted on?" "Yes." Margaret, the whole association voted unanimously. "You can't just unilaterally withdraw it." "Watch me," Margaret said. "I'm president. I'm withdrawing it. This is going to cause problems. People are going to ask questions. Then tell them I made a mistake in my assessment. Tell them the vehicle is technically operational and therefore doesn't violate the ordinance. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. But it's being withdrawn." She hung up and immediately felt the weight of her decision. She'd just made an enemy of the neighborhood association she'd spent 6 years building. She'd exposed herself as fallible, reversible, wrong. It was terrifying. It was also the first truly honest thing she'd done in years. Margaret didn't approach Martin again for another week. She needed time to figure out what she actually wanted to say. Not as the HOA president, not as a representative of community standards, but as, what, a person? An apologist? She'd learned through a conversation with her new therapist. Dr. Patricia, they'd met once, and already Margaret was the kind of patient who kept detailed notes that she had a tendency to use control as a defense mechanism. That her obsession with order and standards was a way of managing anxiety about chaos and unpredictability, that she had never truly grieved anything in her entire life because she'd been too busy organizing everything else around her. "Tell me about Emma Gray," Dr. Patricia had said. "I don't know her. I've never met her." "Exactly," Dr. Patricia said. "But you know her father. You know what he's experiencing, and you've decided that his grief is inconvenient for your community standards. That's not really about the car, is it?" Margaret had wanted to argue, but she couldn't. So when she finally did approach Martin again, it was without the document, without the authority, without the armor of her position. She simply knocked on his door on a Thursday evening, and when he opened it with that hollow look that had become familiar to her, she said, "Can we talk? Not about the car, just talk?" He studied her for a long moment. Then, to her surprise, he stepped aside. The interior of his house was neither messy nor particularly clean. It was the home of someone who'd simply stopped caring about appearances. Furniture arranged without thought. Dishes in the sink, but on the mantel there were photographs. Dozens of them. Emma at different ages. Emma with her father, a younger version who was smiling with the kind of genuine happiness that only comes from genuine connection. Margaret stood in the living room and looked at those photographs, and something broke open inside her chest. "She was beautiful," Margaret said. Martin glanced at the photos. Yeah, she was. Inside and out. She was the kind of kid who made you believe the world wasn't entirely broken, who saw injustice and wanted to fix it. She was going to study marine biology because she was worried about ocean acidification. He sat down on the couch heavily. Seemed like a reasonable thing to worry about, you know? Just a kid trying to make the world better in her own small way. Margaret sat across from him. "Tell me what happened," she said. With the accident, Martin was quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, like he'd told this story many times, but never to anyone who actually wanted to hear it. She'd been to clarinet practice. She was in the school jazz band, not good enough to go professional or anything, but good enough that she loved it. That mattered to her. So I'd pick her up from practice, and we'd stop for ice cream at this place near the high school. We'd been doing that for, 3 years? Since she was 13. It was our thing, you know? He paused, looking past Margaret at something she couldn't see. That day we were driving home. It was a Thursday. I remember that because she had homework due Friday, and she was worried about the essay she'd written for her AP English class. She kept asking me if I thought her thesis was strong enough. She was 16 and already worrying about college essays. He laughed, a sound like something breaking. "How do you worry about that? How do you think about your future with enough conviction to worry?" "What happened with the car?" Margaret asked gently. "The steering went out," Martin said. "Just gave out. I didn't realize at first. I thought I was imagining it, that my hands had just slipped on the wheel. But then we were drifting. Not fast, we were in the slow lane, moving through traffic. But drifting. And I'm trying to correct it, and nothing's happening. And Emma's asking what's wrong, and I'm telling her it's fine, it's fine. Just a little problem with the steering, we're fine." His hands were shaking now. We hit the median. That wasn't so bad, just a bump, really. But it pushed us back into traffic, and there was a commercial truck in the middle lane, and he didn't see us in time, or maybe he did and just couldn't stop, and he just hit us, right on Emma's side. Margaret felt the breath leave her body. The hospital said she died on impact. They said she didn't suffer. I don't know if that's true or if they were just being kind. I've chosen to believe it. It's the only thing that helps me sleep. Martin, Margaret started, but he continued. The investigation determined it was mechanical failure. The steering column was compromised. It had been compromised for a while, apparently. I took it to a mechanic after everything. He said I could have had it fixed for about $400. $400. That's all it would have taken. He looked at Margaret for the first time. I was negligent. I let something that needed fixing go unfixed, and my daughter paid for it with her life. So I stopped fixing things. I let that car rot. I thought about... He stopped, looked away. I thought about a lot of things, but mostly I just couldn't bring myself to get rid of it. It felt like the last concrete proof that she was real, that she existed, that she wasn't just a memory I was making up. You start it every morning, Margaret said. I saw you. You start it and let it run. I need to hear it, Martin said simply. I need to know that something of hers still works, still has life in it, even if it's just an engine, even if it's just for 5 minutes before I kill it again. Margaret sat in that living room and understood something fundamental that she'd been too busy to learn for most of her life, that grief doesn't follow community standards, that loss doesn't respect property values, that sometimes holding on to something broken is the only way to hold on to anything at all. The notice has been withdrawn, Margaret said. I'm taking it back. The association can't touch you. I won't allow it. Martin nodded slowly. Thank you, he said. I don't know if I believe it yet, but thank you. I'm sorry, Margaret said. I'm sorry I didn't know before, and I'm sorry I knew and still fought you. I'm sorry about Emma. I'm sorry about everything. Martin looked at a photograph on the mantel. Emma laughing mid-sentence, alive and full of the kind of certainty that only the young possess. Yeah, he said. So am I. The emergency HOA meeting was called for Saturday at 10 a.m., and the entire neighborhood showed up. Margaret had prepared herself for this, or rather, she'd prepared herself as much as a woman could who was about to voluntarily destroy her own authority. She stood at the front of the community center, facing 18 angry people who felt betrayed, and decided to tell them the truth rather than the version that would make her look better. I made an error in judgment, she began, not bothering with the formal meeting protocols she usually observed with religious precision. I recommended we pursue legal action against Martin Gray based on the condition of his vehicle. I did this without full information. I have since learned that Mr. Gray is a man who lost his 16-year-old daughter in a traffic accident 2 years ago. The vehicle in question belonged to his daughter. He has chosen to keep it as a memorial. She paused, letting that sink in. This changes the context of the situation. Not the facts. The car is still there. It is still in poor condition. It is still visible from the street. But the context has changed, and therefore my recommendation has changed. I am withdrawing the notice, and I am recommending that we allow Mr. Gray to maintain his property as he sees fit, provided he continues to maintain it in a way that doesn't violate any health or safety codes. But the property values, Susan Henderson said immediately. Margaret, you're the one who told us about the property value impact. I was wrong about that, Margaret said calmly. Or rather, I was correct about the technical impact, but I was wrong about its importance. There are things more important than property values. There is a man's grief. There is his need to honor his dead daughter. Those things matter more. So we're just supposed to accept a junk car in the middle of a nice neighborhood? Derek Paulson demanded. Is that what we're saying? That grief is an excuse to let standards slip? I'm saying that grief deserves compassion, Margaret said. I'm saying that for 6 years, I've built this community around the principle of control and order, and I've used that control to avoid feeling anything real. I've used standards as a weapon against human complexity, and I'm not going to do that anymore. There was a silence that felt like something crystallizing. This is ridiculous, Linda Chen said sharply. This is sentimental nonsense. A tragic situation doesn't give someone the right to impair the neighborhood for everyone else. We all have problems. We all have grief. The difference is, we handle it privately. Do we? Margaret asked. Or have we just become very good at hiding it? Linda, when your son died 10 years ago, Linda's face went rigid. You handled it privately, that's true. You put a funeral announcement in the paper and then you never spoke of it again. 16 years later, and I still don't think I've ever heard you mention his name. So yes, you handle it privately. But that doesn't make you well. That just makes you alone with it. My son's death is not the neighborhood's business, Linda said coldly. No, Margaret agreed. But that doesn't mean Martin Gray has to be alone with his daughter's death just to make you comfortable at your dinner parties. The meeting descended into argument about what standards meant, about what community actually meant, about whether grief was a temporary condition or a permanent alteration that had to be accommodated. Margaret didn't fight anymore. She simply stood there and let people argue themselves toward whatever conclusions they were going to reach. By the end of the meeting, the vote was 11-7 in favor of rescinding the notice. It wasn't unanimous, but it was enough. As people filed out, still muttering, Derek pulled Margaret aside. "You just destroyed your credibility with half the neighborhood," he said quietly. "I know," Margaret replied. "You're not going to be re-elected as president." "I know." "Why?" Derek asked, genuinely puzzled. "What changed? You were so sure about this, so committed to the standards." Margaret thought about the photographs on Martin's mantle, about a girl laughing, caught mid-sentence, preserved forever at an age when she was sure of nothing except that she mattered. "I learned that standards are just walls we build to keep ourselves from feeling," Margaret said. "And I'm tired of hiding." The real trouble started on Tuesday. Margaret arrived at her office. She worked in administrative planning for a commercial real estate firm to find an email from Linda Chen, copied to 6 other Oakwood Ridge residents. The subject line read, "Urgent, HOA President Abuse of Authority." The email outlined what Linda characterized as Margaret's erratic and irresponsible decision-making, her abandonment of community standards, and her questionable judgment in reversing a properly voted-upon resolution. It concluded by calling for an emergency removal vote. Margaret read it twice, then forwarded it to her therapist with a note. "Is this what happens when you decide to be honest?" Dr. Patricia's response came within the hour. "Probably. People who benefit from your control will resent you for releasing it. That's not a reflection of your choice's validity. That's a reflection of their investment in your rigidity." By Wednesday, 3 more emails had arrived, each more vitriolic than the last. The most recent one, from Derek Paulson, asked her to reconsider her position before the neighborhood fractures beyond repair. Thursday morning, Margaret received a formal notice that a special meeting would be held on Saturday to discuss her removal as HOA president. It included a list of 17 signatures, half the neighborhood, calling for a vote of no confidence. Margaret printed the document and posted it on her refrigerator, right next to the photograph she'd taken of Martin's morning ritual, him standing beside the Buick at dawn, hand resting on the hood, the rust catching the sunrise like something broken, but still alive. She had lunch with Martin on Friday. He'd been surprised by the invitation, but he'd agreed, and they'd met at a diner near his house, a small, unremarkable place where nobody from Oakwood Ridge ever went. "I'm being removed as HOA president," Margaret told him, stirring her coffee. "Because I defended you." Martin set down his sandwich carefully. "Margaret, you don't have to do this. You don't have to lose your standing for me." "I'm not doing it for you," Margaret said. "I'm doing it for me. For 16 years, I've been someone else. Someone controlled and controlling. Someone who used order as an excuse to not feel anything. But I'm tired of being her. And you gave me permission to stop." "I didn't give you permission to wreck your life." "You didn't wreck my life," Margaret said. "You showed me that my life was already wrecked. I was just very good at organizing the rubble so it looked like a house." Martin studied her with those hollow eyes. "Thank you for seeing Emma's car as something besides an eyesore. Thank you for that." "Thank you for keeping it," Margaret replied. "For being strong enough to hold on to your grief instead of hiding from it. There's nothing ugly about that." The removal meeting was held on Saturday at 10 a.m., and this time, Margaret didn't bother with a speech. She simply sat down and let them vote. It took 12 minutes. The final count was 14-4 in favor of removing her. As she was leaving, Derek caught up with her in the parking lot. "This was unnecessary," he said. "You could have just quietly allowed." Gray's situation without making it a referendum on your entire philosophy. I could have, Margaret agreed, but that would have meant living a lie, again, and I'm done with that. So that's it? You're just going to abandon Oakwood Ridge? Leave us to figure out our own standards? Margaret paused. Standards matter, she said. I still believe that. But they have to be standards that leave room for human beings, for grief and mess and things that don't fit neatly into categories. If you can't have standards that do that, then what you really have is tyranny dressed up as community. 3 weeks later, Margaret received an invitation to coffee from someone unexpected. Linda Chen. They met at the same diner where Margaret had met Martin, and Linda got straight to the point. My granddaughter died, she said without preamble. Leukemia. She was 12. That was 8 years ago, and I've never spoken about it since. Not to anyone. I just put it away and kept moving. And watching you fight for Martin Gray, watching you lose everything to honor his grief. It made me realize I've been putting mine away all this time, too. Margaret didn't know what to say. I want to know about Emma, Linda continued. I want to understand what Martin's doing with that car. I want to understand why that seemed so important to me to destroy, and why that tells me something true about myself. It tells you that you're human, Margaret said gently. That you were afraid of feeling things, so you built walls, just like I did. I voted for your removal, Linda said. Just so you know. I know. I'm taking it back, requesting another vote. Reversing my position. You don't have to do that, Margaret said. I know, Linda replied, but I need to, for the same reason you needed to fight, because hiding is killing us, and we're just pretending it's called standards. The second removal vote never happened. Instead, on a Tuesday evening, Derek Paulson sent an email to the entire neighborhood. The subject line was simply, change of heart. He wrote about his own son who had struggled with addiction for 5 years before dying of an overdose 4 years ago. He wrote about how he'd thrown himself into the HOA and the rules and the standards, because if he maintained enough control over the neighborhood, maybe he could believe he'd had control over his son's life too. He wrote about how Margaret's choice to honor Martin's grief had forced him to see his own. The email was honest and painful and deeply human. It also precipitated a cascade. Susan Henderson sent an email about her marriage, which had quietly dissolved 2 years ago and which she'd never spoken about, instead maintaining the appearance of a perfect wife in a perfect house. She wrote about how she'd supported the notice against Martin's car because the sight of something broken in a place that was supposed to be perfect was triggering something in her that she couldn't articulate. Tom and Rachel Paulson, no relation to Derek, wrote about losing their second daughter to SIDS 20 years ago. They'd moved to Oakwood Ridge specifically because they thought a controlled environment would protect them from further loss. They'd been wrong, but they'd organized their entire lives around that wrongness. By Thursday, a dozen neighborhood emails had arrived, each one revealing layers of hidden grief and loss and pain that had been carefully hidden behind maintained lawns and organized lives. By Friday, Margaret received a formal request to rescind her resignation and resume her position as HOA president. She brought the letter to her therapy appointment on Monday, so everyone's grief is suddenly real to them now, Dr. Patricia observed. Because Martin made his visible. His is the only one that matters, Margaret said. The rest of it, I don't need to be president again. I don't need to be validated. I just wanted them to see that standards aren't the point. Connection is the point. Are you going to take the position back? Margaret thought about it. About the weight of authority, the burden of being the person who decides what's acceptable. She thought about how easy it would be to slip back into control, just now with more compassion, more understanding. How the form would be the same even if the content changed. No, she said finally. I'm going to step away entirely. Let someone else try. Someone who can do it without using it as a defense mechanism. In the meantime, something was happening on Maple Drive that nobody had anticipated. Martin's car had become a point of pilgrimage. It started small, Linda. Chen approached him one afternoon and asked if she could see the photographs. Not just the car, but the photographs inside his house. the ones of Emma. And then she sat down and talked about her granddaughter for the first time in 8 years. And she cried. And Martin brought her tea. And they sat together in the presence of 2 dead girls and found that there was something healing in no longer being alone with the grief. After Linda came Derek Paulson. He came on a Saturday morning and asked to help Martin do something about the car. Not remove it. Martin would never remove it, but maintain it. Properly, carefully. Derek brought tools and know-how, and together they started a meticulous restoration of the exterior. Not to make it pretty or valuable or acceptable by neighborhood standards, but to honor it. To say with their hands, this thing mattered. This girl mattered. We acknowledge it. After Derek came others. Susan Henderson brought flowers for the doorstep. Tom and Rachel Paulson brought a framed print of Emma's junior class photograph, which Martin had never blown up. The Chen family brought a donation to the Leukemia Society in Emma's name. By the 4th week, there was a small community around the car. Not a majority. There were still neighbors who thought the whole thing was maudlin and self-indulgent and inappropriate. But there was a core group of people who had allowed Martin's grief to crack open their own, and who had discovered that grief shared was somehow lighter than grief hidden. Margaret watched this unfold and felt something settle inside her. This wasn't about her anymore. She'd started something, and people were running with it toward their own healing. That was fine. That was more than fine. She started having dinner with Martin every Thursday night. Sometimes they talked about Emma. Sometimes they talked about nothing. Sometimes they sat in silence, and that was enough. "You don't have to keep doing this," Martin said one evening. "Coming by, spending time. You could just let this go and move on with your life." "I am moving on," Margaret replied. "This is part of moving on, bearing witness to someone else's loss, learning that my life doesn't have to be perfect or controlled or impressive, learning that broken things can be beautiful. Is that what you think Emma's car is? Beautiful?" "Yes," Margaret said. "I think it's the most beautiful thing in the neighborhood." It was the Thursday in the 8th week when Martin asked Margaret something that surprised them both. "Do you want to go with me?" he asked. "Tomorrow morning, at 6 a.m., when I start the car." Margaret had never been there for that ritual. She'd watched from afar, at a distance, respecting the privacy of something so profoundly personal. But now he was inviting her in. "Yes," she said. "I'd like that." So the next morning, Margaret arrived at 447 Maple Drive at 5:55 a.m., holding 2 thermoses of coffee she'd prepared. And together she and Martin stood by the Buick as dawn broke over Oakwood Ridge. The neighborhood was quiet, still asleep. The grass was damp with dew. The sky was that particular shade of orange-pink that only happens in those few minutes between night and day. Martin opened the driver's side door. The rust was still there, but Derek had been here earlier in the week with sandpaper and touch-up paint, and while the car would never be pristine again, it was being cared for now. It was being honored. He inserted the key, turned it. The engine cranked and caught and roared to life with that terrible, beautiful, impossible sound of something broken, still learning how to breathe. They stood there while it ran. 5 minutes, just as it always was. And Margaret thought about standards and control and the ways we build walls around our hearts to keep them from breaking. She thought about how those walls had been crumbling all around her for months now, and how instead of disaster, there had been something like grace. When Martin turned off the engine, he turned to Margaret and said, "I've been thinking about selling it." Margaret went very still. "Not because the neighborhood wants me to," Martin continued. "Not because of standards or HOA rules or any of that, but because I think I'm ready. I think I've held on to her memory the only way I knew how, and I've learned that I don't need the car to remember. Emma isn't in the car. She's in my head. She's in my heart. She's in the photographs and the stories and the way Derek comes by now and talks to me about his son while we work on this broken thing, together." He looked at the Buick with something that might have been peace. "I think I'm ready to let her rest," he said. "But not alone. I'm going to donate the car to the high school, to the shop class. They can use it as a training project." Emma would have liked that. The idea of her car being used to teach people something, to help them learn and create and maybe do better than I did, being negligent with maintenance. When? Margaret asked. 3 weeks, Martin said. They need time to set up the logistics, and I need time to say goodbye. Margaret told Dr. Patricia about the decision in their session on Friday. How do you feel about it? Dr. Patricia asked. Relieved, Margaret said. Sad, but also resolved, maybe? Like something that's been broken is finally finding a way to become whole by breaking all the way through and coming out the other side. That's very poetic, Dr. Patricia observed. Is it? Margaret thought about it. I've spent so much of my life being afraid of poetry, afraid of anything that couldn't be quantified or controlled. And now I'm discovering that some of the most important things are exactly the things that can't be controlled, that resist control, that insist on existing in their own complicated way. Are you going to help him with the donation? Dr. Patricia asked. I'm already planning it, Margaret said. There's going to be a small ceremony, a recognition, not to make it a neighborhood spectacle, but to honor the fact that Emma mattered, and that this car was part of her story, and that even though her story was cut short, what she was supposed to teach the world is still here in the form of mechanics and principles, and the truth that negligence has consequences, and that we have to be responsible and careful with the things we care about. That sounds like something Emma would have appreciated, Dr. Patricia said. I think so too, Margaret replied. I think she was the kind of girl who understood that everything connects, that small actions have big consequences, that caring about ocean acidification and proper car maintenance are the same action dressed in different forms. They're both about honoring the world enough to take responsibility for it. The ceremony at Roosevelt High School was scheduled for a Saturday morning 3 weeks later. The shop teacher, a man named Marcus Webb, who'd been teaching automotive classes for 18 years, had arranged for the 1987 Buick LeSabre to be the centerpiece of a special assembly. The parking lot filled up early. It wasn't just the neighborhood, though they came, all of them, even Linda Chen and the other holdouts who'd voted for Margaret's removal. It was also the school, the superintendent, the students from Marcus's 5 different shop classes, the principal, Emma's former teachers, who remembered a 16-year-old girl who'd asked good questions and always turned her homework in on time. There was even a representative from the State Highway Safety Commission, who'd come to discuss the findings of Emma's accident investigation and the importance of regular vehicle maintenance. Martin stood beside the car, and he was crying, but not the broken crying he'd been doing for 2 years. This was different. This was the crying that comes when you finally exhale after holding your breath for a very long time. Margaret stood beside him, not saying anything, just bearing witness. The principal spoke about how the school had decided to name this teaching project in Emma's honor, the Emma Catherine Gray Maintenance and Safety Initiative. The goal was to emphasize to students that car maintenance was a form of respect for human life. Derek Paulson stood up and told the assembled crowd about his son and about how he'd been using control as a way to avoid grief, and about how Martin's courage in facing his grief head-on had given him permission to face his own. He didn't cry, but his voice shook. Linda Chen spoke briefly, just saying, "This girl would have mattered. This girl should be remembered. This car will teach people that we have to pay attention to the things we're responsible for." Marcus Webb opened the hood and pointed to the steering column that had failed all those years ago. He explained what it was, why it had failed, what proper maintenance would have prevented. And he said to his students, when you're working on cars, when you're making repairs, when you're checking systems, you're not just keeping a machine running. You're potentially saving lives. That's the weight of responsibility we carry in this room. And then, finally, Martin spoke. I've been holding on to this car for 2 years like it was Emma, he said, his voice steady. Like keeping it would keep her alive would mean she never really left. But I learned something from watching this neighborhood deal with my grief alongside me. I learned that the people we love never really leave, regardless of whether we keep their belongings. Emma is here, in the way I wake up every morning and remember her, in the way I'm trying to be careful and responsible going forward, in the way her teachers saw her and are remembering her, in the way this community has opened themselves up to their own grief because of what she taught them. Not through anything she said, but just through the fact of her absence. He placed his hand on the hood of the Buick. This car is no longer my private memorial. It's now going to be Marcus's teaching tool, and every student who works on it is going to learn something about responsibility and consequence. And in that way, Emma continues. She continues teaching. She continues mattering, not through rust and decay, but through the act of learning and growth. He looked at his son's car one last time, and then he stepped back, and Marcus and 4 of his students took control of the vehicle, preparing it for the first lessons that would use it as a training platform. That night, Margaret made dinner for Martin at her house, the first time she'd invited him to her home. They sat at her perfectly maintained table, with her carefully organized kitchen visible through the doorway, and Margaret made a decision. "I'm redecorating," she announced. "I'm taking down all the family photographs that came with the house and don't mean anything to me. I'm painting the walls. I'm getting rid of half the furniture. I'm going to make this place actually reflect who I am, instead of who I thought I was supposed to be." Martin smiled. "That sounds like a project. A big one," Margaret agreed. "Do you want to help?" "I'd like that," Martin said. Over the next month, 47 Maple Drive ceased to be a point of contention in Oakwood Ridge and became, instead, a point of pride. The car was gone, but the work that had been done on it remained. The restored exterior, the details that Derek had sanded and painted, the care that had been invested. That space in the driveway was paved and maintained, and Martin had planted a small garden in honor of Emma. Not as a grave, he was clear on that, but as a living memorial. Flowers that bloomed and died and bloomed again, cycling through seasons the way life did. The neighborhood watch changed its focus. Instead of maintaining standards, they began maintaining connections. Neighborhood dinners were organized where people were invited to share stories about loss, grief, change. The spaces between houses became less about property lines and more about genuine relationship. Margaret's house became a gathering place on Thursday nights. She still met with her therapist regularly, still worked on the parts of herself that had been built around control, but now she did it in the context of community. People came to her house and brought their own stories. Linda Chen came and talked about her granddaughter. Derek came and talked about his son. Tom and Rachel brought recipes and memories and slowly learned to mention their daughter's name without dissolving into grief. The HOA continued to exist, but its function changed. Instead of enforcing standards, it began facilitating connection. Property values continued to increase, though not as rapidly as before, because houses in a community, where people were engaged and connected and honest with each other, turned out to be worth more than houses in a community where everyone was pretending. 3 months after the ceremony, Derek stopped by Martin's house with news. "The shop class is requesting extended time with the Buick," he said. "Marcus wants to make it a multi-year project. Says it's the most pedagogically rich teaching tool he's ever had." "That's good," Martin said. "That's what I hoped." "The students are learning about mechanics, but they're also learning about consequence," Derek continued. "Marcus assigns them to research the accident investigation report as part of the coursework. They learn that small failures can have enormous consequences. They learn to be careful, to be responsible. I think Emma would appreciate that." "I think so too," Martin agreed. It was in the 5th month when Linda Chen approached Margaret with an unusual request. "I want to do something for my granddaughter," Linda said. "Something like what Martin did for Emma. I was thinking about establishing a scholarship for science students, for kids who want to study environmental science or marine biology or anything that has to do with understanding systems and consequences, like Emma was." "That's beautiful," Margaret said. "I want to call it the Emma Gray Memorial Scholarship," Linda continued. "Because the truth is, without Emma, I'd still be hiding from my granddaughter's death. I'd still be alone with it. I'd probably die in my house maintaining my precious standards, never acknowledging that I'd lost someone. Emma's death, and the way Martin honored it, gave me permission to grieve my own loss. So Emma's memory is part of my granddaughter's memory now. They're connected." Margaret felt tears on her cheeks. "Yes," she said simply. "Do it!" 18 months later, Margaret stood in the gymnasium of Roosevelt High School and looked at the wall that the students had created. It was a memorial to Emma Catherine Gray, but not in the traditional sense. It wasn't a plaque or a photograph or a list of achievements. It was a visual representation of the Buick LeSabre at every stage of its restoration and transformation. Photographs showed the car in its rusted state, then being sanded and painted and detailed. The steering column was preserved in a special case with a plaque explaining what had failed and why. There were student essays about learning to be responsible. There were sketches and diagrams. There was a quote from Emma's clarinet teacher. Emma played with the kind of precision and care that made you believe she understood that every note mattered. Marcus Webb stood beside Margaret, proud but not boastful. "It's beautiful," Margaret said. "It is," Marcus agreed. "You know what's remarkable? Every single student who's worked on this car has become more careful in general. Not just with cars, with everything. With their schoolwork, their relationships, their attention to detail. It's like understanding consequence in one context makes them understand it everywhere." "That's what Emma was trying to teach," Margaret said, even without knowing she was teaching it. That attention matters. That care matters. That small things have big repercussions. "She'd have made a good marine biologist," Marcus said. "She would have," Margaret agreed. "But instead, she's making mechanics careful and engineers thoughtful and an entire community honest with themselves about grief. I think that's a form of marine biology, too. Actually, the study of systems and how they function, how one thing affects another." Martin appeared at the gymnasium entrance, and when he saw the wall, he stopped. Margaret watched his face as he took it in, the preservation of his daughter's memory in the form of a teaching tool, in the form of knowledge passed on to other students, in the form of a community choosing to be better. He came to stand beside Margaret, and he didn't cry. He was past the point of crying for Emma, but he was smiling the way a person smiles when they finally understand that letting go doesn't mean forgetting. "I brought something," he said to Marcus, holding out a photograph. It was Emma in the car from when she was maybe 14. She was laughing, caught mid-sentence, alive and full of certainty. "I'd like to add it to the memorial," Martin continued, "not to make it about me or my loss, but because she belonged in this car. She belonged to this car. And now her car belongs to the school, so she should be there too." Marcus took the photograph and looked at it carefully. "We'll place it with honor," he said, right at the center of the display. That evening, Margaret hosted a gathering at her house. Not a Thursday night session. This was something different. This was a celebration. She'd invited the core group of neighbors who'd transformed alongside her, Derek and Linda and Tom and Rachel and Susan, and several others who'd opened themselves up to genuine community through the process of acknowledging their own losses. They sat in Margaret's living room, which was now decorated with actual furniture that Margaret liked, with colors that reflected her actual preferences, with photographs of people she actually knew and cared about rather than generic family photos that came with the house. "I wanted to thank everyone," Margaret began, "for being brave enough to acknowledge what was real beneath all the standards and control." "I wanted to thank you," Linda countered, "for showing us that there was something beneath the standards, for being willing to be wrong, for valuing a man's grief over a neighborhood's aesthetic." "We all did that," Margaret said. "It just took all of us to make it real." Derek raised his glass. "To Emma," he said, "for teaching us what we forgot we needed to know." "To Emma," everyone echoed. They drank, and the sound of glasses clinking together was like bells, like the possibility of new beginnings. "I've been thinking about what I want to do next," Margaret said. "In terms of work, in terms of my life. I've spent a lot of time in administrative planning, controlling how things are organized, how spaces function. And I'm thinking I'd like to pivot. I'd like to do something in grief counseling, in helping people acknowledge loss, in creating spaces where people can be honest about pain." "You're going to go back to school?" Susan asked. "For a certificate," Margaret said. "Nothing too formal, but enough to do it properly, to honor the work the way it deserves to be honored." "That's beautiful," Rachel said quietly. It's terrifying, Margaret admitted. But so was everything else we've done in the past 18 months. 3 weeks later, Martin sold his house. It wasn't because he was running away from Oakwood Ridge. The neighborhood had become his genuine community, not just a place where he lived while maintaining appearances. He was selling it because he'd realized something fundamental. He didn't need to hold on to a place to hold on to memories. The memories weren't in the house or the car or the neighborhood. They were in him, in how he'd learned to carry grief without letting it destroy him. He bought a smaller place 5 blocks away with a workshop in the back where he could do carpentry and restoration work. He'd decided that he liked working with his hands, liked the meditation of careful, precise, maintenance-oriented work. He was training to become certified as a furniture restorer, work that involved taking broken or damaged pieces and making them beautiful again, not by ignoring the damage, but by honoring it, by working with it, by transforming it into something meaningful. I think Emma would understand the poetry in that, he told Margaret when he explained the new career path. Broken things don't have to stay broken. They can become beautiful in new ways. Like you, Margaret said gently. Broken by grief, but becoming beautiful in new ways. Like all of us, Martin replied, because by now he understood that his was not a unique story. Every person in the neighborhood who'd been honest about loss was on a similar journey. Broken in different ways, becoming beautiful in different forms. 10 months later, Margaret stood in the front window of her newly opened counseling practice and looked at her nameplate on the door. Margaret Whitmore, MS in Counseling Psychology, Grief and Loss Specialist. The office was intentionally not sterile or clinical. It had plants, photographs, art, books, comfortable furniture. The kind of space where a person could bring their pain and not be asked to package it neatly or process it quickly. Her first client was Derek Paulson, continuing the work he'd started 2 years ago when he decided to acknowledge his son's death. Her second was a woman from another neighborhood entirely who'd read an article about the Emma Gray Memorial at Roosevelt High School and decided she needed help grieving her own loss. And then the referrals started coming. From Dr. Patricia, from Marcus Webb, whose students often carried unprocessed trauma about consequences they'd witnessed. From hospitals and funeral homes and grief support groups, Margaret discovered that she had a gift for sitting with people in their pain without trying to fix it or minimize it or organize it. She'd learned the importance of that from watching Martin with his Buick, from understanding that sometimes the most important thing was simply to acknowledge, yes, this matters, this pain is real, and you're not alone with it. On the 2nd anniversary of the day, Margaret had first knocked on Martin's door with a legal notice. A celebration was held at Roosevelt High School. The Emma Gray Memorial Scholarship had been awarded to 8 students over the 2 years of its existence. 4 of them were pursuing environmental science. 2 were studying marine biology. 1 was planning to become a mechanical engineer, specifically focused on vehicle safety systems. And 1 was going into counseling psychology, inspired by witnessing her own father's grief and transformation. The 8 students stood at a podium, and each one spoke about how they'd learned about Emma and what her life had meant to them. Even though they'd never known her, she died in a car with a broken steering column, one of them said. And that accident, that tragedy, turned into a teaching moment that shaped my career choice. That's the kind of impact one person can have even when they're not here to see it. Emma cared about the world, another said. She cared about ocean acidification and systems and consequences. That carefulness, that attention to how things affect each other, is something I'm taking into my own work. Martin sat in the audience, and he was crying again, but this time it was with gratitude rather than despair. His daughter had mattered so much that 2 years after her death, she was still shaping lives, still teaching, still making the world more careful and considered. Margaret sat beside him and took his hand. They'd become something like family to each other, bonded through the experience of learning to hold pain and still move forward. When the assembly ended and the crowd filtered out, Marcus Webb approached them. "I wanted to tell you," he said to Martin, "that the Buick restoration project is becoming permanent. The school board voted to make it part of the standard curriculum." Every year, every shop class, every student will work on this car. We'll learn from it. We'll understand what it means to be responsible with the things we're entrusted with. That's, Martin started, then stopped. Overcome. That's Emma's legacy, Marcus continued gently. Not just the scholarship or the memorial, but the fact that a mechanic's understanding of responsibility is now embedded in the education of hundreds.